Deputy Co-Director of the Philoctetes Center. I've also been appointed chairman. In other words, I've been arranging chairs. That makes me, I like purpose. I'm a pragmatist. It's sort of a follower of Dewey, actually, in addition to being psychoanalytically orientated. In any case, good afternoon and welcome to Freud and the Historical Imagination. I am now proud to introduce Richard Armstrong, who last appeared at the Philoctetes Center as a member of the panel, The Origins of Freud's Imagination. Richard Armstrong is Associate Professor of Classical Studies and Fellow in the Honors College at the University of Houston. He's the author of A Compulsion for Antiquity, Freud and the Ancient World. He has published articles and book chapters on classical studies and psychoanalysis, including Last Words. Is that Said?
Yes.
Said, he was my advisor at Columbia.
Okay.
Said, Freud, and Traveling Theory. Theory and Theatricality, Classic Drama and the Formation of Early Psychoanalysis, Being Mr. Somebody, Freud and Classical Education, and Marooned Mandarins, Freud, Classical Education, and the Jews of Vienna. Dr. Armstrong will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce the other panelists. So I give you Dr. Armstrong.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Ed Narsessian and Francis Levy and Ellen Fertig and everyone else at the Center for making this possible today. To begin, alphabetically, first we have Diane O'Donoghue, who is chair of the Department of Visual and Critical Studies at Tufts University, in affiliation with the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She's a member of the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and she's been a Silberger Scholar there. She was fortunate enough to have be a Freud Fulbright Scholar and a visiting Fulbright Professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And she received the Course Prize from the American Psychoanalytic Association in 2002. Her most recent publications include articles in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association, American Imago, and Visual Resources. Welcome, Diane. Next, George Prochnik, author of Putnam Camp, Sigmund Freud, James Jackson Putnam, and the Purpose of American Psychology. He is, in fact, the great-grandson of James Putnam. His most recent essay has been published in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Cabinet Magazine, and he's currently working on a book about Stefan and Lotte Zweig in the Americas. To my right here, Peter Rudnytsky, professor of English at the University of Florida, another Gulf Coast refugee. Right? He's editor of American Imago and an honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association. In 2004, he was the Freud Fulbright Scholar in Vienna. And he's the author of many books, including the classic work Freud and Oedipus, also the Psychoanalytic Vocation, Psychoanalytic Conversations, and Reading Psychoanalysis, for which he received the Gradiva Award in 2003. He's also been editor of numerous books, including Psychoanalysis and Narrative Medicine. And last but certainly not least, Joel Whitebook here to my right, philosopher and practicing psychoanalyst. He's on the faculty of the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research, and is writing an intellectual biography of Freud for Cambridge University Press. He's one of 4 analysts also, as you may know, to participate in a running commentary on Season 3 of The Sopranos for Slate.com, which apparently received more hits than anything. I don't know if this is still true if you've seen the latest Slate.com history of posterior fashions, but he's our wise guy on wise guys. So those are today's participants, and I thought we would begin with some introductory comments and move from there, beginning with Diane.
Thank you. When I received this is a challenging format, so I'll just kind of move a bit from time to time. When I received the invitation to be part of this last summer, I was writing at the time on Freud's construction of the latent and manifest in the interpretation of dreams. And while that text may not be the first that comes to mind when one thinks about the intersections of history, historical imagination, and psychoanalysis, I actually thought, and probably just by the fortuitous nature of the intersection of this invitation and that work, that in fact the concept of the dream has been a fairly fruitful and powerful one in notions of history and historical imagination. Said, whose name has already been present here, in the late 1970s wrote a book, very important book, Orientalism. I'm sure many of you know of it. In it, he posited the concept of the Orient as having emerged as a kind of European imaginary, rather than an actual place. And one of the ways that he spoke about the Orient was in terms of a dream. But not just any dream, but definitely the Freudian dream. And in fact, he spoke about the making of the historical imagination of the Orient as having a manifest content and a latent one. And the manifest being the notion of facts, historical facts, knowledge as objects that seem to bring the reality of the Orient. But he said that countering these notions of a more traditional history, that there was this latent, this world of unconscious activities, of desires, of passions, of projections. And this book really, and the positing of this model of European history as a historical imagination was very, very powerful in creating what has come to be known as a field of post-colonial studies. In the 1990s, the work of people like Homi Bhabha and others have really questioned the unidirectional notion that it all just comes from Europe onto the non-European, and in Said's case, the Arab world, that there's much more of a give and take. There's much more bidirectionality going on between peoples. But even in the later work, you see such a strong indebtedness to a psychoanalytic model of psychic functioning. Certainly there's many critiques of this in studies of difference and ethnocultural difference and colonialism, but I think this is a place where there's still a very vibrant notion of a historical imagination happening. But on the other side, because I was working on Freud's genealogy within his own work and the interpretation of dreams of latent and manifest, I had a chance to also see how when he was creating the manifest and wanting to have it so different from the latent, that one of the things he did was turn to what he then would have seen as a very respectable new history discourse, ethnography, and even art history, and appropriated some very interesting concepts to make the manifest a kind of regressed phylogenic part of our own antiquity. You know, he was very distrustful of the visual imagery of the manifest and saw it as a kind of primitive symbolization. And in doing that, he actually utilized, and if you read in the interpretation of dreams and the part on regression, the part on symbolization, he really talks about these, the fact that we are our own mental antiquities, that we carry these relics. But he used a lot of the proofs for this, I think, in his mind, in the ethnographic and art historical literature that he read and copiously annotated at that time. So in thinking about this whole question, you know, brought about by this invitation, how interesting it is that from Said on, we have used these models of psychoanalytic functioning as a way to critique phenomena, let us say like the historical imagination of the colonial world, where yet we also, embedded within those, are also issues where we could really speak of a historical imagination. So I think instead of this, in a way, negating everything or Xing everything out, is quite the opposite. It shows what a very rich and vibrant exchange there are, not without their problems, certainly. But I think that this, a forum like this really opens up a group of questions about contemporary discourse. So,
thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. It's a real honor to be with scholars of this caliber. You know, when I read the last question that's in the sheet that I think most of you have received about did Freud liberate the historical imagination, or was his work in some way just the opening up of this novel and interesting theater of projections? I mean, I thought, well, yes, he liberated the historical imagination, and that is in some way, to me, a theater of novel and interesting projections. I had some trouble in making the distinction, while recognizing, obviously, that there is there's an objective history. The telling of that seems always to ask for an intervention. And I think in part of Stefan Zweig's definition of history being like an artichoke, where you keep peeling back leaf after leaf and never getting to the inner core. And this is why he said you need the artistic imagination, the emancipated imagination, to intervene at a certain point. And there's a way in which I think that idea we can link to Freud's approach to history, also through the artichoke, And I'm thinking of that moment in the analysis of the Dream of the Botanical Monograph, where he talks about the moment when he specifically analyzes the folded color plates. And these, to him, become the trigger to an actual memory from his childhood of this very strange and wonderful moment when his father presented him and his sister. He says that he was, I believe, about 5 and his sister about 3, and his father presented them with a book, which he notes in passing was a book of Persian travel, some kind of memoir of Eastern travel, and he gave it to them specifically for the purpose of destroying it leaf by leaf. And he remembers this blissful moment where the two of them sat together before their father, taking apart this book. And he then meanders from this to say that he not only is that memory the only plastic memory of that period that he retains, but that he comes back to this memory as the awakening moment of his own passion. His own passion, as he says, that it's a screen memory for what are in fact his own bibliophiliac propensities. But perhaps we have to ask whether he may be letting himself off a little bit easily, and maybe there's a way in which Freud's own manner of reading and of thinking about history carries something of that demolishing artichoke, tearing apart like quality. I mean, certainly what he does to figures of authority involves a work of dismantling. He also, as we know, is one of the most brilliant mosaic artists of citation of any writer. And this, to me, recalls also this kind of leaf-by-leaf separation of these once monolithic works. And we know that there's some legitimacy in linking this approach to Freud's vision of history, which is a vision of ruins, by the way that he in fact picks up the same story a little bit later on in the interpretation of dreams, and remarks, as he goes through the chain of associations between favorite food and favorite flower, he remarks, as he repeats this idea of leaf by leaf, he remarks a phrase that must make us think of the dismemberment of the Chinese Empire, which is, again, a sort of unexpected link, but certainly one that shows us, I think, the way that Freud looks at history, in the space between the stones, and sees these as the opportunities, just like perhaps the separation between drive and object, the space of fantasy, the space of imagination. And my own interest in my book and a lot of my thought is the ways that these things play out in America, and the problem of the American historical imagination and the problem of America for Freud. And I wonder, and I hope we can speak a little bit today about the ways that perhaps issues of the historical imagination can give us clues as to why he would have made such famous remarks as America is a mistake, a gigantic mistake to be sure, but nonetheless a mistake. There's a remark by Karl Kraus, along with the famous one where he said psychoanalysis is the disease it purports to cure. He also, apparently, on first hearing of the popularity of psychoanalysis in America, said something like, no wonder it's a big hit. The Americans love everything they haven't got, especially antiques and the soul. And my own feeling is that in some way what the Americans took was more to do with the soul than perhaps the antiques. But Freud was clearly anxious about the ways that America's own anti-authoritarian tendencies would do to his own work what he did to the works of others. That's one area that I'd like to hear other thoughts on. And it gets into his own issues with what we do with our leaders. And there's a curious small note that I'll just end on, which from Civilization and Its Discontent, where he remarks that worse, I think he actually says, worse than the situation of a culture that doesn't properly restrain its instincts is a culture where the members of the group are over-identified with each other, where there's not a real leader. That this leads to this psychological impoverishment of groups. And he specifically invokes America, and he says we can learn a great deal about this sort of degradation of American civilization if we think about this further. So much of Freud's historical vision is a vision of overthrowing the leader, from Oedipus through Hamlet, etc., etc. He saw in America, perhaps, a ground already too leveled. The overthrowing had happened. It's something that predates him. Where was the narrative arc going to be built if there wasn't anything left, any father left to kill? And this comes back to the father, perhaps, with the book, allowing the destruction of the Persian book of travel. So.
What? Peter?
That was very interesting. I almost feel I should throw it right back to Diane, since she's written on the botanical monograph Dream, and might be able to address some of George's comments at some point in our conversation. It's really a great honor for me to be here as well. I saw the piece in the New York Times about the Philoctetes Center, in which it was remarked that at no point during the entire symposium was there any mention of Freud or sex. And it occurred to me we would not have that problem here today.
We only came to one session of the report.
Okay. Because having heard about Freud, I want to talk a little bit about Freud and sex. Because as you probably saw last December, the article in the New York Times concerning the discovery of the hotel log by the German scholar Franz Mashevsky, who found in a Swiss hotel the register of the book in which Freud had signed in with his sister-in-law as his wife. And so we made front page news when we published this in our journal in English. And the question of Freud's relationship to his sister-in-law is one that has interested me specifically, and it's a kind of particular question that has its own level of specificity, but it raises, I think, lots of very general questions. And in our conversation, we'll probably range from the macro, broad cultural sphere to the personal space, and probably see how deeply connected they are. And for me, the question really that we're talking about is the role of subjectivity and personal experience in theory formation. And related to that is the question of the epistemological status of psychoanalysis. I personally do think that psychoanalysis has a scientific dimension and is underpinned, or should be underpinned, by scientific thought. However, as a form of therapy and in its hermeneutic dimension, I think it's intimately connected to personal experience into the subjective realm, and it's precisely the interplay between those two dimensions that particularly interests me, so that in asking the question about Freud's relationship to his sister-in-law, it's part of the broader question of the role of Freud's own life history, his personal experience in his thought as a whole. And one of the reflections that has been helpful to me is by Peter Lowenberg. And what I'm really trying to do here is to extend a project that's been part of my work from the beginning, which is to turn psychoanalysis back on Freud, and to see Freud as a kind of exemplar of the theories that he's proposing, on the theory that Freud, too, is a human being, and if not true about the human condition in general, if Freud said something that's interesting and true about himself, that's at least worth building on. So it's the self-analytic dimension of Freud's work that I'm still thinking about. So Peter Lowenberg said in a little article he wrote on the 150th anniversary of Freud's birth that a typical 19th century biography with no reference to the body, sexuality, dreams, or articulated private fantasies is unacceptable and virtually unthinkable today. And I think most of us who work within a psychoanalytic paradigm would have absolutely no quarrel with that statement. So that we'd want to know, I mean, in some ways this falls into the realm of gossip, you see, that this is precisely the stuff of our intimate lives, our fantasies, as well as our acts, our things that could be trivialized and disparaged as mere gossip, but they are the stuff of our lives and of our experience. And that's precisely what the psychoanalytic inquiry, I think, asks us to focus on. The problem is then if we extend this general principle back to Freud himself and really take seriously the possibility that he engaged in an affair with his wife's sister. And even though I think psychoanalysts have shown a considerable degree of emancipation from the previous tendency to idealize Freud, this is still a subject that I think makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And where there's a deep tension between the commitment to a kind of unprejudiced inquiry into the truth, whatever it might be, versus a sense that this really takes us in a place where we really don't want to go. And I'm actually here not going to try to persuade you that there was such an affair, although I think there is overwhelming evidence for it, but really just to engage in the thought experiment of what if there was such a relationship, what difference would it make? It's kind of the so what question that I'm asking. Would it change anything in our understanding of psychoanalysis as well as of Freud's life? And in kind of encountering what I think is still a resistance against taking this question seriously, one other source that has been helpful is an article we published in the spring issue of American Imago by Maynard Solomon, the musicologist, called Taboo and Biographical Innovation, where he was dealing with Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and pointing out how very often there were things having to do with the life of these famous composers that had been readily available on the surface of the documentary record, and once someone put them together, the consequences seemed to flow with a certain inevitability and obviousness, but it had been very difficult for someone to come along and do this. And in a certain way, I think this is actually the case for the Minna situation. And Solomon points out that there is in biography a taboo against doing this kind of work that gravitates, in his words, to the dominant issues of personal knowledge and surrounds every effort to demonstrate that human beings are destructive and deeply sexual creatures. So psychoanalysts, being human and loving and taking Freud as seriously as we do, understandably are made uncomfortable by this. I mean, I don't think that that's something to criticize in people, but I think we want to try to get past it. So, to me, a kind of representative statement that shows me the direction that I don't want to go is what Peter Gay wrote when the Minna letters were first made available for inspection in the Library of Congress. They're now published and available in German. But he wrote in an article called "The Dog That Did Not Bark in the Night" that was originally published in the New York Times Book Review and then included in his collection called Reading Freud. He said that in writing my biography of Freud, I could, of course, not ignore the provocative Minna question. I knew that Freud's possible love affair was immaterial to any appraisal of the validity of his ideas. Now, I'm taken aback by that last statement because it prejudges the very question that I want to ask today. Okay, how can he say that? And if he says that about the Minna affair, isn't he really saying that Freud's life in general is immaterial to the appraisal of the validity of ideas? Whereas I would say that his thought flows in some profound and radical way from his life experience, and that's precisely what makes it so rich and valuable. And what Gay has said about the Minna question is, I think, a particular instance of what James Strachey said about the important paper Screen Memories, which has been mentioned by George and is a fundamental paper, I think, in the development of Freud's thought. But, of course, as you know, has in the central section a dialogue that after Freud's death, it was established by Siegfried Bernfeld that the interlocutor with whom Freud was speaking was actually himself in disguise. And so there is what Freud called in the preface to the second edition of Interpretation of Dreams a further subjective significance to the paper that we now are in possession of. And in fact, once we see how obviously it is all about Freud, this is one of the prime sources of information about Freud's early years in Freiburg and his history and so on. And we kind of see this as obvious now, but it's paradigmatic of how our perception of a text by Freud changes once we see that it is deeply autobiographical on one level. And Strachey wrote in his editorial note to this paper that, quote, the intrinsic interest of this paper has been rather undeservedly overshadowed by an extraneous fact, namely that we know that it's Freud, you see. And again, he's calling what I think is the most important thing about the paper extraneous, and trying to separate that out from what he calls the intrinsic interest, which is the theoretical. And I think that's profoundly unpsychoanalytic, fundamentally. Then maybe what I'll just kind of wrap up here by saying is that we know this paper was written in 1899, and the content of the paper has to do with in the central section, not the larger theory, but in this autobiographical part, where the disguised patient, who is in reality Freud himself, is fantasizing about various women in his life that he could have married instead of his own wife, where the metaphor of snatching away the flowers, of course, is about deflowering. And he mentions two important women in his past, his half-niece, whom he calls his cousin, Pauline, whom he'd met when he revisited his half-brother in Manchester, and the girl upon whom he had a crush in his adolescence, Gisela Fluss. And he had seen both of them again after having had feelings toward them in his earliest childhood. And he has a sentence in there about how the fantasy of the wedding night causes the young scapegrace not to think about what comes after he gets married. And what I would propose to you is that whether or not Freud and Minna actually consummated their affair by 1899, I don't necessarily think that they did until 1900, where I think there's good evidence for that. But we know that they roomed together, and that Freud signed in with his sister-in-law as his wife. So they must have had a fantasy of being married, and at least the thought of an intimate relationship certainly must have crossed their minds. And therefore, when Freud speaks about the fantasies of various women that he could have married, to me, the paper must be about Minna Bernays, who is the woman in his life in the present. You see, coming back to the question of the latent and the manifest, that it's the present circumstance of the paper, that it goes unspoken, that must have been the driving force behind his whole construction of the narrative and his fantasy. And to me, that's radically changed my understanding of the paper. And it doesn't exclude the role of the infantile in determining the unfolding of the structure of his desire, where the mother and the nurse in his childhood play out in the two women in his adulthood. So it doesn't contradict the fundamental discoveries of psychoanalysis, but it shows how deeply embedded Freud's own life experiences in his theories. And therefore, I would propose that we reflect on the role of theory and the role of subjectivity in the formation of theory and creativity more generally.
Wow. Jill.
I have the advantage. Oh, first I want to tell a story. I can't resist. The comment about the artichoke reminded me of an experience I had with Joyce McDougall, who many of you may know, and who is one of the French analysts who adheres very strictly to drive theory and the importance of sexuality. And I said to her once when I was a little boy, the only vegetable I would eat were artichokes. And she said, I know, it's so much fun to pull back the skirt and see what's underneath. So she thought she knew what was behind the latent content. It was very clear. What I started to say was it's both an advantage and a disadvantage to come last. It's an advantage because I had a chance to hear what everybody said, but it's a disadvantage because I feel like I have to scuttle the remarks I prepared in my head and address myself to what's been said so far. And I can approach that by saying something about my dual background as a philosopher and as a psychoanalyst. I spent 7 years in graduate school at the New School studying philosophy. And as a philosopher, in a particular tradition, what's beaten into your head is you can't make the naturalistic fallacy. That there has to be a distinction between what the philosophers call the realm of Genesis and the realm of discovery. And all we can deal with, insofar as we're rationalists, the realm of Genesis and the realm of presentation, the way a theory or a concerto or a novel is presented. So all we can deal with is the realm of how the thing is presented. Mozart's biography has nothing to do with one of his piano concertos, for example. There's sort of a strict Kantian view that you get in many philosophical departments in this country. Then I went into my psychoanalytic training. The realm of presentation is also the realm of validity. That's the important point I missed out. The genesis of a work has no bearing on the validity of the work, whether it be aesthetic, scientific, philosophical, or what have you. And then I went to do my psychoanalytic training, and I discovered all the analysts talked about was Genesis. Genesis, 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 Genesis. So-and-so did such and such because X, Y, and Z had happened in his background, or so-and-so wrote the, you know what it is. And during this period, it occurred to me that the really interesting but also crucial question as far as the status of psychoanalysis as a theory and an enterprise is concerned is the relationship between genesis and validity. Hans Lowald said, we have a genetic theory, but it's not reductionistic. How are works of art, scientific theories, mathematical theorems, produced out of the slime of history, as Sartre called it, out of all the sexual, subjective, contingent details of an individual's life, but how do they nevertheless achieve some sort of claim to validity? How is an object, a cultural object, how does it get detached from the conditions that produced it and achieve a certain degree of freedom vis-a-vis them, so that we can say it has its validity in its own realm. Which leads us to the question of Freud. How can we say that everything we know about his development, about his sexual fantasies, about his relation to his father, about the relationship to his mother that he wanted to hide, about his crush on Frau Fluss, and so on, taking all that into consideration, and the more we know about it, the richer our understanding is. How can we explain how he nevertheless created a theory and a practice which achieved a certain degree of freedom vis-a-vis those biographical and genetic sources? Because if we can't say that, then there is no validity to what we say or do. Freudian theory would be on the same level as Freud's fantasies. So the psychoanalytic practice would be on the same level as countertransference. There would be no room for validity. Now, that brings me to disagree with what Peter said about the Minna episode. Okay, it may be one detail which is important in studying Freud's biography. But I think the amount of emphasis that's been placed on it is not only ridiculous, but sort of infantile. I think Peter Gay and Peter Swales are sort of the two poles of this infantilism. Peter Swales thinks if he can prove that Freud slept with Minna, the whole edifice of psychoanalytic theory comes tumbling down. But Peter Gay accepts the assumption. He feels like, at least in what he wrote in the Times when the registry from the hotel is found, he feels like he has to prove that Freud didn't have sex with Minna, because if he did, then the whole edifice will come tumbling down. But, well, that's the question. Okay. But, no, the question is why do both of them have the same belief?
Ernest Jones did not.
Can I finish, please?
Why don't we just wait a moment, let Joel finish.
They both shared the same assumption, and this goes to George's point, because I think they both are really infected by, Peter Swales is an American, but a certain American Puritanism. And that if, Freud, the master, had this flaw in quotes, and acted on it, then he suddenly becomes de-idealized and everything he did doesn't count. Peter said that Freud talks about things that, we gossip about. Jonathan Lear, in one of his latest books, said something about, well, Freud talked about things the ladies talk about in the kitchen or in the beauty parlor, or this or that. Well, there's this very famous quote from Aristotle, which Charcot quoted to Freud, and which Freud quotes with respect to Charcot. And it's about understanding that hysteria, this sort of lowly pathology which has to do with all these crazy lower class women, that this particular phenomenon is a place where great scientific discoveries about human nature can be made. And the quote from the story from Aristotle, I believe, describes Heraclitus sitting in the kitchen by the stove, and a couple philosophers come walking by, and they sort of look down on him and don't want to come in here. And this is not a place for philosophers. And Heraclitus says, "Come in here, for there are gods in here too. You'll find gods in the kitchen too." And it's true. In our clinical practice and in our theorizing. I mean, we talk about the stuff of the kitchen, the stuff of the bathroom, the stuff of the bedroom, the stuff of the nursery, and so on and so forth. But what separates our discussion of it from mere gossip? I mean, to use this metaphor, how can we say that there are gods in here too, and that what we're after is the gods and not the gossip?
Well, as you can see, we have a remarkable range of opinion here and interest. And I'm not trying to put the peels back in the artichoke, but what I thought we might do is to, I'm just going to suggest an avenue based on what's been said for the rest of the discussion. And that is to go back for a moment for general consideration, which is to what extent is the really incisive contribution when we look at specific historical research and investigation and critique. At the level of critique, again, that is the psychoanalytic insight that leads us to look at precisely those things that previously were not considered worthy of consideration, especially thinking of dreams again, so much that becomes, evidence, basically. Or is it the level of synthesis, which is to say, precisely how do the elements of the subjective contribute to what is historically significant? And I thought I might start there, just, to throw that out to you again, is a critique or synthesis that maybe we can find the most valuable contribution of psychoanalysis to the historical imagination. But we might think about it in terms of the very concrete scenarios that we've just brought up. That is America, on the one hand, and the other, precisely the role of Freudian biography as we think of not only the practice of psychoanalysis, and as well as the way we look at 20th century history. I mean, since Freud seems to loom so large when we think of the scenario of fin du siècle Vienna of the 20th century, First World War, the Holocaust, there are many ways in which Freud becomes part of this narrative. So, yeah.
And I'll say what I wanted to say the first time. In this kind of, I mean, I think, Freud is, the rap on Freud is that he was an ahistorical thinker. And that he discovered all these scientific theories which he thought were transhistorically and transculturally valid, and that history was just a few variations on a few medleys on some old themes, as somebody put it, and that he was really a very ahistorical and almost ontological thinker. And there's truth to that. But at the same time, I think to understand Freud and locate him historically, and to understand the historical nature of his thinking, we have to realize that maybe the break with tradition was the most important thing that occurred in his life culturally. In the course of 3 generations, from his grandfather Shlomo to Sigmund in Vienna, the Freuds were a family that started out as Orthodox, perhaps even the Hasidic shtetl Jews, and 2 generations later, Freud was a secular bourgeois European living in one of the great capitals of Europe. And I think the break with tradition runs right through Freud's father, Jacob. He had one foot planted in tradition and one foot planted in modernity. And I think that's all encapsulated in the Philipson Bible, which he gave to Freud, read with Freud when he was 6, and then gave it to him on his 39th birthday, whatever, 30-something or other, 33. Because the Bible, on the one hand, he wants to pass on tradition to Sigmund, but not pass it on in the traditional way. Pass it on in a post-traditional way. Because the Bible was in German and in Hebrew, it had illustrations, it was, to an Orthodox Jew, it would have been heretical. But more importantly, it had an enormous scientific apparatus as footnotes that talked about anthropology, the history of mythology, medicine in the ancient Near East, and so on and so forth. In this scientific apparatus, footnotes, was a commentary on the Bible, which means it objectified the texts that defined tradition scientifically. It wasn't taken as just dogmatically handed down from generation to generation, and said, now we can step outside of tradition and reflect on it. We can step outside of tradition and understand it scientifically. And I think one of the ways you might understand Freud's project in general is he was trying to figure out how to, that psychoanalysis and the psychoanalytic project was supposed to be a way of how to live in a post-traditional world after the twilight of the idols. And he thought, for better or for worse, science and history, or scientific understanding of history, was going to provide us with some means for living that replace just traditional ways of going on. And I think this is so important today. I mean, Said's book, which tries to extrapolate Freud's ideas for the third world, or the non-European or non-white world, I think this is so important today because all the issues that come up around Freud and the break with tradition, the role of science, the role of the Enlightenment, the role of secularism, bear directly on the big debates we're having today. And I highly recommend Mark Edmondson's book, which just came out in Freud's last 10 years, where he really shows how, far from being obsolete, how relevant Freud's cultural writings were.
Joel, can I just say that coming out of what you have said, and Peter, really, George, everyone, just thinking to the next step of those comments about the Philipson Bible, that the one dream that Freud had about the Philipson Bible was the one in which his mother is carried out with these bird-headed figures. Right. So maybe, sort of following a very recent article in Psychoanalytic Dialogues by Kimball and Leary, this notion of the particularization of a phenomenon, so that you're absolutely correct about the power and significance of the Philipson on many levels, certainly on Freud's visual imaginary too, but then the use of that for something highly specific relating to the death of his mother's father, among other things, may be getting us closer now to, what is it about Freud's contribution, not just the particularization of that incident, but creating a history of particularization within broader constructs, of course, and we can argue about those, the Oedipus, et cetera, but it is placing the notion of subjectivity, I guess this is now back to Peter, in a very different context. So that's the addition to the imagery of the Philipson that seems to just work with your thoughts too.
I think we might also mention here the importance of the archaeological metaphor, because as any archaeologist can tell you, one of the joys of it is that they deal with a particular very much so, and that's one of the reasons why archaeologists always feel that they're on firmer ground than people like philologists who have to work always extrapolating meaning from text. And yet archaeology requires considerable interpretation. And so going back to what I was saying about critique or synthesis, again, this is sort of the interesting question to me, since I work, again, from the perspective of the influences of historical sciences dealing with antiquity on the genesis of psychoanalysis. How is it that if you begin to look at the process of analysis, is fundamentally one of breaking down, peeling the artichoke, etc., again with the notion that the self is a kind of open site, an open archaeological site. This was a very important metaphor in part because of the dynamics that go on in the process of analysis and the concerns over suggestion, to think of yourself as excavating as opposed to intimidating or cajoling or somehow getting evidence from someone's psyche. It was very important to have that kind of paradigm. But the question is then, what is the role of a narrative synthesis? Just as the archaeologist, again, can dig on the site for a considerable amount of time before coming to the conclusions about what it is, etc. This was a paradigm of success that was very important to Freud. Some of the images, again, that are so striking about when would you know that you've truly discovered something about the past through archaeology? Well, when you have, for example, a wonderful inscription, and it will tell you exactly what was there and why it was there. As I've said in my book, this is a paradigm of success that kind of eludes him in some ways. That is, knowing in this constant peeling of the artichoke, right, in this constant critique of what people remember, what they think they remember, and what is beyond remembering, that there will be that point of synthesis, again, the contribution to the narrative aspect of history that can be made possible.
And I think I would add to that just that, that's obviously been one critique of the case histories. It's when he chose, where he chooses to kind of chisel out the last bit of stone and say it stops here. And that's something that's come back against him. Some of the more extreme attacks has certainly been where he decides we have a final, and where we have that evidence and the nature of, because he certainly will say that this was the moment of revelation, and this is the moment where the history falls together. And it comes, returning to what you said about the debate and sort of the obsession with that debate about the adultery. Certainly there's a way in which I think Freud may provoke that kind of concern, at least in a certain level of reading, because of how much the eureka moment is part of certain key case histories. And he, in his own personal story, and this comes out again and again in the interpretation of dreams, he certainly, we focus so much on Oedipus as opposed to when the Sphinx doesn't give the answer, and he denies ultimate meaning in these ways that have to trigger certain sorts of deep drives, I think, on at least to know more what his personal history contains when he says, I'm not giving you the ultimate meaning of this dream. I've taken you up to this point, but I'm not giving you that next, that final layer. And that's, I think, got to have been a conscious strategy at certain points. And there's a way in which he tangles his followers, I think, in a labyrinth of very provocative, loose personal biographical ends, weaving in when he says a story is his own when he says it's not a story. When in Screen Memories he says there may not be any such thing as a childhood memory, and that obviously has such deep repercussions for history as an idea. If all of these memories are constructed or emerge at these different points of storytelling to ourselves, to others.
With respect to your first point, he was always looking for the historical event, whether it was the killing of the father or the primal scene. You can read Freud always on both sides of the question. But in The Wolfman, he says, well, we can't decide whether the primal scene really happened. We'll have to leave the question undecided. Mm-hmm. And then in the Screen Memory paper, he says, we'll never know whether it's true or not. He says, maybe all we have is not memories, I don't remember the exact phrase, that refer to the past, but are directed towards the past, or something like that.
Or we only have memories related to the past, not memories of the past. I mean,
Yeah, something like that. That we know that they're. I wish I could remember the exact word. Related to the past, but they may not be of the past.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the sense of it.
Right.
And I think the problem is, and with the sort of emphasis on the role of construction and subjectivity in postmodern philosophy of science and recent psychoanalysis, we're in danger of losing all reference to the object. I mean, I think the discussion has gone on for a long time now, and we have to bring back the question, which John McDowell does in philosophy, how after the linguistic turn do our theories still rub against reality? Or how do they rub against the past? I mean, we've been concentrating on how they're constructed for so long that we sometimes fall into sort of a subjectivism, a constructivism, or solipsism. And now the question of how does all this construction relate to some sort of object, I think has to be readdressed. And you know, the prototype for distorting projection is, of course, paranoia. And Freud has a quote that not too many people pick up on. Lowell did. Freud says, well, paranoics project, but they don't project into the blue. So to explicate the sense of not into the blue, I think, is the really hard task that we have to do.
I agree.
Peter.
Well, I'm here to learn from the responses of others, and I'm eager to have more people join in. And so much has been, so to say, put on our table.
Exactly. I was just wondering, since you had raised the Freud and Minute question again.
The provocative Minute question. I mean, all the thoughts really sort of, I think, have been running together and opening up such wonderful questions. If I refer myself to Joel, since I think his comments were the most specifically addressed to the issues that I raised, if the two other Peters are, in your view, agreeing about the way that the reality of this affair would somehow, they both, in your presentation, agreed that if Freud had this affair with men, it would somehow undo the psychoanalytic enterprise. Your view seems...
A bit of hyperbole.
Right. Well, you know, somehow that it's very important that we not acknowledge this because of the damage it would do, and I think, as you said, not simply to Freud's personal reputation somehow, but to the epistemology of psychoanalysis or to the theory. And you raised, if I can just interject a parenthesis, I think in your more theoretical remarks, this interesting question in terms of the dialectic of philosophy and psychoanalysis about genesis and meaning. And that's really kind of Grunbaum's point, I think, that whenever we interpret the meaning of a dream or of a psychic phenomenon, our hope is that through the associations we can, as it were, undo the transformation of the latent into the manifest content if we grant that model. But we can never be certain, of course, that the meaning that we arrive at, even if it seems to be somehow deeply true and moving, that we've successfully accounted for the formation of the dream. That's only going to be an inference. And so I think that's a fair point. We can never, with complete certainty, move from interpretations of meaning to explanations of genetic causality. But my own experience, whether it's in the study of literature and art, intellectual work, or psychoanalytic theory, what have you, that to me it always deepens my appreciation and my sense of understanding. It doesn't take anything away from the autonomy of the work of art or the intellectual validity or not of the theory. And I mean, in some ways, I suppose I would concede that if something is said to be true, if I'm persuaded that it's true, then in some way the subjective origin becomes uninteresting. But anytime we're dealing with error, then I want to understand what caused the error, and in that case the personal factor is relevant in some ways. Perhaps if we're talking about the realm of the subjective, we're always dealing with error. And even though I think there is a dimension of psychoanalysis that is scientific, I think there's an ineradicable dimension of it that's subjective. And in that sense, I do want to know, insofar as I can bring this to bear in my understanding. And I think in every instance that it changes the way we see and we understand. And that to me is an enrichment, not a diminution. So what troubled me in your remarks was that you simply said that it doesn't matter, that it's trivial. And that in disagreeing with Peter Gay and Peter Swales, you kind of implied that it wouldn't be significant. And I don't agree with that. And here, coming back to George's remarks and also his excellent book, Putnam Camp, which I strongly recommend to anyone interested in the topic of our symposium today, I'll quote something George wrote. It's just a sentence, and it echoes his comments. He says that Freud's own self-analysis, at least as recorded in the interpretation of dreams, is less the brutally honest exercise in self-exposure that his followers, like Jones, claimed it was, than a mimesis of a self-analysis. And I think that now there's always going to be, if we shift our vegetables from the artichoke to the mushroom, there's always going to be what is the image that the root of it, that grows, that will never penetrate to the heart of the artichoke completely, or to the root of the mushroom. But if we imagine that Freud, when he's writing his most landmark works in 1900 and 1899, 1901, is dealing with a secret in his own personal life, that it's not simply American Puritanism that retroactively has made too much of this. And in fact, I think not enough has been made of the minute question. I think it's only begun to be seriously considered. And that the way that our understanding of Freud and the history of psychoanalysis will deeply change once we've integrated this into our thinking has not yet really been considered in a serious way. That we have a very good reason for understanding why Freud stops short as much as he does, why he's unable to really tell us what's going on. And in some way with the Minna affair, if we accept it, and it could be a fantasy, but if we accept it as something that actually occurred in the real, we're kind of reintroducing into the space of psychoanalysis in which in the unconscious there are no indications of reality, the real, you see. So we've kind of returned to the dialectic of the real and the fantasy. And again, I'm going to quote George because I learned so much from reading his book, referring to, he says, about the Viennese Secession movement, of which Freud was a contemporary, if not an admirer. He says, when Manet's Olympia defiantly confronted society with the fact that sexuality exists, where Manet's Olympia defiantly confronted society with the fact that sexuality exists, the secessionists went further, confronting sexuality itself with the inescapability of mind, of trauma, imagination, and memory, and defining what constitutes the erotic. And I think the point here is that this is what psychoanalysis does. It confronts us not simply with sexuality's existence, but with the inescapable ability of mind in sexuality. And I never want to lose that. So nothing I'm saying is it meant to diminish the role of fantasy in our understanding of Freud's experience or of psychic life or of psychoanalysis, but the brute reality that sexuality exists in a form that is in the present and that would cause one to want to engage in rather radical acts of self-concealment. By contrast, say, with Putnam himself, whose paper on Griselda fantasies, I think, is a direct echo of Screen Memories in significant respects, where Putnam is much more overt and honest about his masturbation fantasies, and where, in fact, we know that the way that Freud and his circle read Putnam's paper was precisely to identify a JJP complex. Okay, where for them the meaning of the paper, although this was only circulated in private communications, the paratext of psychoanalysis, but this is part of the history of psychoanalysis. We can't separate the theoretical papers from the correspondence and the role of the intersubjective life of the people who form the movement. That Putnam has, like Ferenczi, gone well beyond Freud in the honesty of his ability to take the truths that Freud taught and live them in his life in a way that I think Freud was unable to do. And the problem of authority that Freud got so hung up on in conflict with truth, I think, is radically about the secret of the Minna affair. And in my reading of The Trip to America, this is when the chickens come home to roost. Okay? So maybe this allows us to bring America back into the conversation.
Can I put a caveat that maybe we can bring America back in? I mean, you said that Freud's was constantly critiquing authority and one way or another killing the father. But there's the other side, and this is really parallel to what I said before, but he also says, take what was your father's and make it your own.
Right.
So you not only kill the father, but you also have to appropriate the tradition.
Right, you have to literally consume it. You know.
Yeah, consume it.
wird es, es zu besitzen.
And look at all of the great avant-garde people of the 20th century, Schoenberg, Picasso, Joyce, they all consumed the tradition. They cannibalized it. So I think maybe I'm very interested in your question about what bothered him so much about America. And I think maybe what bothered him here was there wasn't enough tradition to consume.
You know, I think that's certainly part of the problem. Certainly, we have to look at the question of, if we come back to ruins, and sort of how much, if his process in an archaeological sense also is about reconstituting the ruins, the absence of these over here, the absence of enough history maybe to sink his teeth into. But also I think there's the issue of the difference in the American usage of history and what at least that generation, among whom Putnam was part, what they wanted from history. And I think that part of what they took from Freud had to do more with a reincorporation of ideas of the American wilderness, which were receding at the time. That their interest was more about returning to almost some prehistorical paradisial state. And this was an extreme problem for Freud, obviously. I mean, if the goal was not the reconstruction of Rome, Jerusalem, and some majestic edifice of mind and history, if their goal was more kind of to bring us through analysis into a space where we were free of history and lived in a kind of natty bumpo wild animal riddled state, but one of innocence and immense, I think, potency. He also, I'm just suggesting that Freud was also worried, not only about the absence of history, but maybe even of the goal of the historical understanding as he took it among that particular generation of New England intellectuals. And it's not that, these were people steeped in historical knowledge as well. They had all studied in Europe. But I think that their interests diverged from his about what you did with that. And this comes into why sublimation, I think, was in part of why it was so important to the Americans. They said, you dug back far enough that you could sweep it all away. And as much as Freud, their ideas of catharsis, etc., he doesn't want to leave that. He doesn't, he wants to linger in the ruins, I think. And that's a sharply distinct aim.
George, because you've thought so much about this issue of America, where does modernity come into this? That is, the difference between his concept of seeing himself as a modern subject and the issues of modernity as played out with his colleagues in America at that time.
Can you say a little more?
Just this notion that that in the United States there was clearly less of a historic precedent on which to build a narrative of the past, and a great impetus towards the progress narratives, I would assume. And I'm just curious about where you see the difference in the American versus European notion of the tensions between the historical moment and the modern imperative in those two.
Well, certainly something that I think, again, I'm just thinking about this place that Freud was taken by Putnam, this place Putnam Camp, this retreat in the Adirondacks, something that Freud in his letters home picks up on very, very incisively and strikingly, is the degree to which this retreat was a kind of faux rusticity, that it wasn't an actual primitive state. And Freud kind of pegs this immediately and understands that he's in a sort of theater of primitivism, which would only be accessible, I think he implies, to a certain kind of American self, because, which is the ultimate, urban modern, because of these retreats were, of course, in their their grounding was an urban intellectualism, and simultaneous with his critiques of this lack of history was his sense of the Americans running too fast into the future. I mean, the problem, different things that he says in New York, and what he is troubled by is also coming back to what you said. There are issues of they're not going to incorporate their leaders enough, and this maybe returns to some of the ideas in group psychology, where the distinction that Freud draws between the herd instinct and what he wants to call the horde man. And I think he sees America as not crystallizing around a modern self because there's an insufficient idealization. He makes there's a curious remark, something that I think it's in a letter to Jung, but I wouldn't swear on it, that he writes one of his comments on American women. He says that there is, that the idealization of the father is insufficient to the point where they can't muster the illusion necessary for marriage in America. And that gets at so many.
There's also the quote from Thoughts of a Time on War and Death, where he contrasts a European love affair to an American romance. And he thinks Europeans have a tragic sense, and they know how high the stakes are when you have a love affair, and they know what can happen and consequences and so on and so forth, but they go ahead and do it anyway. Whereas the Americans, don't have a sense of, all the tragic potentialities lying behind it, and just sort of engage in a superficial flirtation.
The issue of tragedy, I think, is at the heart of a lot of this. And what he saw as an absence of a tragic imagination is maybe close to the problems with the historical ones. But I'm interested in what you would have to say about sort of the American visual landscape and sort of the ways that maybe wilderness was constituted in art and things, and what Freud might have.
I know, and I just went by the Guggenheim and saw this American spiritualism show, which I have not seen, but I assume includes these immense landscapes. This, as you were speaking, and now I'd wonder what Richard would think about this too, is that it almost feels like between this primitive, which, as I mentioned in this concept of the manifest, Freud was really so involved in this ethnography, but in a very different way, the quote-unquote primitive, than the antique. It's almost as though there was not the mediation of the period of the primordial or primitive with the classical in America to get to the modern. So I think that there's because I've been reading his annotations in this book from the late 1890s on the origin of art, which was essentially by Ernst Gross, a very famous art history of quote-unquote primitive peoples, and all of their symbolizations and all of their imagery and their dance and their rituals. But he really was utilizing that in a phylogenic way to say that we were still carrying those ancient pieces inside of ourselves, and was certainly positing that in a way that was both hierarchical and very judgmental about the higher functions. But the classical occupied a very different realm.
Well,
or not maybe, but I mean, I'm just curious.
Part of the interest, first of all, is, of course, when you have this explosion of ethnographic data that gets digested by Europeans, and partly through the Golden Bough, great works like that, which make a revolutionize classical studies. At the same time that Freud is interested in writing things like Totem and Taboo, there's a group of scholars at Cambridge, the Cambridge ritualists, who are interested in looking for not necessarily the first time, but in a more rigorous way, the way in which Greek tragedy, for example, again may harbor certain we might say ancient rhythms, very, very sort of prehistoric aspects of culture, instead of thinking them solely as these paradigmatic works of art. So it's part of a sort of general trend that you might say the European imaginary has to go through when all of this ethnographic detail is sewn up in part through evolutionary theories, again, and notions of culture, that sort of begin to make you think that human culture evolves in a sort of unilinear fashion, but the advantage of ethnography is you get a window in the prehistoric, before the standard European narratives are there. So there's a certain fascination with the prehistoric that I think is very, very strong in that regard, and I think a lot of members of the psychoanalytic movement engage in that sort of because in part the newness of the past when they began to orient themselves towards that. But there is a certain, I call it an evidentiary quadrilateral that's important in the way that Freud looks at that. That is to say that one can look, obviously, in neurotic behavior and in children's behavior for these vestiges, these phylogenetic vestiges of earlier states of mind, earlier ways in which the human, pre-civilized human behaves. And find, again, confirmations in either ancient civilizations or modern primitive or pre-industrial societies. That is to say, societies that are observable or have been observable, within the last 100 years by anthropologists. And it's precisely that, strange group of evidence that can be, deployed for, theoretical purposes, sort of ad infinitum, that I think we see, to me, one of the most fascinating aspects of the earliest 20th century. I call it kind of discursive incontinence because, when you think of all the discourses that Freud dabbles in the history of religion and ethnography, etc., I feel tremendously envious because you can't quite get away with that in the same way anymore. But, what I thought was interesting, for example, about Said is, this is just to go bring Said back in since we began with him. One of his very last works was actually given as a lecture at the Freud Museum in London, and it was a reading in part of Freud and the non-European, right? His interest in the non-European. And what I thought was interesting is, again, we go back to the question of what kind of culture hero is Freud himself for us. Said, who is so critical of the way in which again, European discourses on other, non-Western others is used, gives a reading of Freud that sort of ignores some of the ways in which, again, you could find problematic his use of, Aborigine rituals and all this sort of stuff. And I thought that was kind of, to me, shows you a little bit about the paradox of Freud for us in the historical imagination. That is to say, he remains a kind of culture hero, in precisely these bold synthetic gestures and the way in which, again, he forces us to look into the history of human sexuality and culture, the tragic aspects of it, but in a way that can often suspend the very critical apparatus that Said himself had sort of, created in looking at Orientalism. So I don't know if that answered your original question or not. But. Yeah, I think it's now time for us to have you join in, and we have a first question here.
Larry Cutler, retired. What came to my mind with this discussion was Marx and capitalism, when he talked about the theory of capitalism, and he used England as the example, but he said it's not England I'm talking about capitalism. But he used it as an example because it was the most highly developed capitalist country in the world. And he said if anybody says, well, what about Germany and France? He says, they're going to go through the same thing when they get to it, which has turned out to be true. So I'm wondering with Freud, with this question that came up about personal history, that although he used the dreams as an example of how the mind functions, wasn't that objectively. He used the dreams, his dreams, because that's the only dreams he could use to bring about the theory of the unconscious. Now, I would like to add one little thing, that it's possible, they used to say that Marx might have had an affair with the woman who took care of the kids. So does that mean that capitalism, there may be problems with capitalism, but was that the reason why Marx's theory was no good? I mean, it's really funny. And there's only this thing about America, and then I'll finish. It's a long question. Seems like in the United States they don't seem to have a sense of history as much And you can notice that by the fact, I mean, here's Freud from Europe, there's Marx from Europe, there's others, and yet you don't see any American of that same stature. And when you hear these people talk about U.S. history, even the leaders now, I mean, they revise it in a very immature, superficial way. There doesn't seem to be anybody who, maybe they haven't been around long enough in the United States. It's just too young. Very interesting.
Joe?
Well, I think the point about Marx is well taken, because he thought, you know, what happened in England is just an example of what's going to happen everywhere else.
Right.
And I think I agree with you that there's a similar structure of thinking in Freud, and I think this is what separates him from Said. Actually, I've had this discussion with Said. Freud had an idea about modernization and modernity. It's what Castoriadis called the project of autonomy. That there had been some special breakthrough in the West, which was going to, which involved the idea of individual autonomy, science, secularism, and so on and so forth. And he thought that, you know, this constellation, this project of autonomy, had happened in the West, and he and a lot of other people, including myself, believe that this is valid for the rest of the world and was going to spread. And I mean, you know, so many Western intellectuals now have mud on their face because it hasn't happened. And the question, I think, with Freud and the non-Western world is whether the deep values that underlie his project about autonomy, about rationality, about the critique of idols, and so on and so forth, and science, whether we still adhere to those values, or after the postmodern critique and post-colonialism and so on and so forth, and the resurgence of religion and fundamentalism, whether we can still abide by them, whether we're still committed to them. They arose historically for contingent historical reasons, which many people have debated about, but once they arose, they were there. And Freud was committed to them, but are we still committed to them?
I mean, where do you place in that? I think that I would agree with that in the main, but then in something like Civilization and Its Discontents, with that kind of deep cultural pessimism about the track of progress, and where that passage where he systematically undercuts each one of these advances. I mean, those are not individual autonomy and these broad stroke issues that you bring up, but how do you fit that into? How do you fit Civilization and Its Discontents and that particular problem that Freud himself raises in with his sense of this achievement of
Not easily. I actually had a student who once raised the question, we were reading his cultural writings, you know, Future of an Illusion and Civilization and Its Discontents are so close to each other. But in the Future of Illusion, he is articulating this project of autonomy. He's uncharacteristically optimistic, upbeat, and almost utopian. And then, boom, he writes Civilization and Its Discontents, where he becomes very skeptical about the whole idea of progress. But then, strange as it may sound, I think there is still something of a progressive note left in Moses and monotheism. Because I think what he was saying, at least for his followers, that we're going to continue this critique of the false gods, the critique of the idols, that started with the Mosaic tradition and got transformed into the scientific tradition, even if it's just a bunch of us, you know, huddled around the Torah in London, we're going to keep this flame going. Mm-hmm. I mean, like everything in Freud, the devil can pull either side. And I mean, I won't go into it, it's too technical, but what changed between Future of an Illusion and Civilization's Discontents was his evaluation of the superego. In the Future of an Illusion, he thought the superego was this psychic agency which is going to reconcile people to civilization, as he puts it. But in Future of an Illusion, the superego, because the internalization of aggression, becomes something which causes the self-vitiating nature of civilization, the civilizing process.
Other questions from the audience?
Who's behind you?
I'm sorry.
You have to go to the...
You go to the
microphone.
Go, Bonnie, go.
This discussion, perhaps paradoxically, is making me think about my life as a clinician, because I'm struggling with the idea that it seemed to me was presented that there's a somewhat clear-cut dichotomy between the scientific and the subjective. And I think in the clinical experience, which of course is not the only thing we're talking about here, there's a constant process of trying to create a kind of science of the subjective, which is to try to find the ways in which to understand your own subjective experiences as they are aroused and piqued by the material that you're hearing from your patient. I think one of the things that I certainly took away from my training analysis was the whole process of trying to understand myself, not to get rid of all the things that might come up about myself, but so that I would know what they were when they did emerge, and that they would emerge, and they would continue to emerge in all the work that I did with patients, and that my purpose was to try to see them, look at them, and try to put them in a place where they were interfering as little as possible with what the material was coming up from the patient's life. And so I've been sort of struggling with how to position myself as a clinician in this discussion and help, basically.
Well, let me just offer a few thoughts and responses to both interventions from the audience. I appreciated Mr. Cutler's reference to Marx and the housekeeper.
You do have a dirty mind.
I think it's an occupational hazard. And that there's been some work on Einstein and his personal life, but I think the real analogy for me is actually the lost tomb of Jesus, where, as you may recall, there's some considerable archaeological evidence, which again maybe doubles back to some of our earlier reflections, that Jesus and Mary Magdalene may have had a child together. And to me, that is actually a valuable context for our reflections on Freud and his role as the founder of the psychoanalytic movement. Now, in terms of what you're calling the science of the subjective, I'm sympathetic in one sense to what you're saying, but I would frame the question differently. I guess it's a matter of how we use the word science. And if we use the German Wissenschaft, of course, that's a very broad term that can be used to encompass natural science or the social or human sciences. But in my own thinking about psychoanalysis and as a scholar of the humanities, I'm uncomfortable using the term science in the realm of interpretation, because the problem that we continually come up against is we can interpret anything from any theoretical standpoint, and we can achieve meaning that seems to create a good fit in the dialogic encounter between the two human beings or between the interpreter and the text. So if that's the case, there's no basis other than personal preference, ultimately, for adjudicating completing theoretical claims. Therefore, we have not established the basic prerequisite for a scientific outlook, because in my view, in a rather traditional understanding of science, we have to be able to falsify. We have to be able to discredit and discard conceptualizations that do not stand up empirically to rigorous scrutiny. And in order to do that in psychoanalysis, although I think clinical processes can be usefully studied with scientific methods, ultimately we need to go to extraclinical realms to sort these things out. And therefore, if, for example, we don't accept Freud's particular version of drive theory, that's because there's very good evidence from infant research and ethology that that model just doesn't seem to be well supported empirically. We need to have different frameworks, in my view, you see. We're never going to be able to sort that out clinically. But once we have come to that understanding, if we have, from the evidence that is available to us through research, then I think that's likely to make us better clinicians, because we're not going to be utilizing explanatory frameworks that really don't hold up in what we might think of as a scientific way of thinking. So there's no contradiction, in my view, ultimately, between the theory and the practice. It's just important not to confuse the realms, because then I think we do end up in what we might call a muddle.
Before we go on to the next question, there's one announcement. There are people downstairs, and if you'd like to come up and pose any questions, please do come up now and come to the microphone.
Very briefly, I just want to say, I think, and you will all think if you think about it, we have some very great American historians. So I don't accept the argument that we are too young or that we don't compare with European historians. We have had a number of great historians in this country. Maybe not Jacob Burckhardt, but pretty good. The other thing I wanted to say was that in 1909, when Freud made that remark about America being a giant mistake, it didn't mean that he didn't admire very much Mark Twain, or Thornton Wilder, or Edith Jackson, or A.A. Brill, or Dorothy Burlingham, or I can go on, and you know what I'm driving at. So he said it, but his life was not constantly total rejection of America or Americans. And he liked American dollars. There's a letter when patients came, he said, yes, you can come. What? Yeah, thanks to George W., not anymore. But he said, if you pay me in dollars, I'll find an hour for you. And I just want to mention, if you're going to have discussion of historical imagination, somebody, one would hope, would bring up R.G. Collingwood, whose famous essay on reenactment and the historical imagination and the idea of history is probably one of the most brilliant discussions of the historical imagination, written certainly in the 20th century. And the other person I would mention, well, not in that category, but he probably should be mentioned, and that's Erikson, who had a real sense of psychohistory, and maybe in a certain way took from Freud and developed that even further than Freud. But Erikson was the great merger, I believe, not Bruce Maslish, but Erikson merged history and psychoanalysis pretty well, I think. Not without some problems. But anyway, but Collingwood, everybody should read Collingwood's idea of history. If you haven't, you probably have and know about it. Thank you.
Any comment for the next question?
Hi. I just wanted to say a word about this.
Say who you are.
Oh, Mary Bergstein. I'm from Rhode Island School of Design, Providence, Rhode Island. I just wanted to, well, I don't need the microphone anyway, but I just wanted to say a word about the...
Please talk to the microphone because it goes downstairs to people.
Okay, I'll try. About the Minna affair. And it's something I don't know anything about, but there are models, I think, in history and history of literature that we can look at to illuminate that, or at least this is what occurred to me when I heard Joel and Peter duking it out over here. First of all, there's this, Hayden White came up with the concept of social buzz when he was working on the idea of fiction as having historical validity. And that has been interpreted and carried on much more now in Renaissance literature by Lauro Martinez, who also talks about the idea that there's not very much early Renaissance fiction, but what there is has a lot to do with social buzz. And in Martinez's opinion, it doesn't matter so much whether something in a fictional or hearsay account really happened or not, but what matters is that there was this buzz, and that this buzz continued through history, and people were still talking about it. So I think to that fact, I do think that, I mean, this has been said already, but just to reiterate this, that the smoke can be much more important than the fire in the Minna affair, and that everyone's the reactions through history, including that of Jung when he was confided in, and one thing and another, is just as interesting, or not more, if not more interesting, than actually whether it was a Freudian slip in the hotel room where he wrote "und Frau," maybe that was a Freudian slip, maybe he was so used to writing that or something like that. It could have been.
That's a new one to me. I never heard that explanation. I have heard that he was unwilling to shell out the money for the extra rooms. That was purely
No, but to a man used to checking into, well, he didn't check into hotels with his wife that much, but it would have been a formula that could have just come out,
sure.
A slip of the pen, so to speak. Anyway, and can I just say one more thing about the concept of wilderness in America? I think that there's this gap between American Protestantism in the 19th century, where the wilderness has a kind of sacral quality about it, and where still to people of my generation, winter camping had a kind of sacral quality about it, that in all of European history is pretty much absent, because the wilderness, I'm not saying cultivated farmlands, but the wilderness was the equivalent of, Dante's dark wood and the wilderness of sin. And I think that too much wilderness, like maybe even the Adirondacks, for a European, even of Freud's generation, who was a city dweller, like for many Europeans even nowadays, could have freaked him out as being, it's a little bit too much wilderness. And especially since in Freud's view, New York was its own kind of wilderness, with its own kind of lack of control.
Yes, Handel could have traveled from Vienna to London safely at a time when you actually probably didn't want to go from New York to Philadelphia.
I think that's...
Any self-respecting Phillies fan would be proud to be in Philadelphia.
I just want to say very quickly to that, I think that's incontestably so, and it comes out directly in what he wrote. And Jung also, they look at these mountains, and it's simply, to them, they think they're seeing wilderness that has never been touched. I mean, Jung was even swept away, real primeval forest. I mean, as I started to say, Freud starts to get it when he gets in the camp, that there are two things going on, and he was attuned to that. But there's without question that it was too much. And Freud, who also thought of himself as a wonderful walker, was very troubled by his first efforts to walk in the Adirondacks. And
I wonder what he would have thought about the Catskills.
Might have been a little more to his speed, especially if he could have gone and seen some good comedy somewhere and then
maybe you can help me out here a little. Richard Wagner was perfectly willing to admit all the minnas in his life. He had a real minna, in fact. Always willing to talk about sexual experience and to write correspondence about it. But he refused to admit that these women ever had any influence on his work. He refused to allow them into his theory. Theory, he said, had nothing to do with what actually happened to you. In fact, if something really happened to you, you wouldn't be able to write about it. He said, do you think that Shakespeare actually had to have gone through what Othello did in order to write about infidelity and jealousy? No. So I'm just wondering why he would have been so against admitting to any kind of importance of his own subjectivity when it came to his music dramas.
That's a question about Wagner or a question about Freud?
Yeah. It's a question about Wagner.
About Wagner? Oh, okay.
Yes.
This is the famous case of Wagner, as Nietzsche would say.
Yes, it's his own case. I'm not getting an answer.
About Wagner?
Good thinking.
What?
Yeah.
I think it may come back in a future roundtable if you come.
This isn't actually a question. You mentioned Thornton Wilder, Lillian Grunwald, child psychologist. Thornton Wilder, when Freud met Thornton Wilder, he really wanted him to marry Anna. He never knew that Wilder was gay.
Well, that would have made...
They couldn't have been Iranian.
I'm Jerry Flieger. I teach at Rutgers. I was wondering if each of the panelists could perhaps just address what you mean by the term historical imagination, because it seems like we're speaking in many different registers, all of them interesting, but sitting here listening, it's a little bit frustrating knowing when to dive in, because it seems on the one hand you're talking about Freud's interpretation of history, the interpretation of Freud's history, in the case of Peter, a kind of elision of the terms imagination and the imaginary. Is the historical imaginary the same thing as the cultural imaginary? Is the historical imagination the same thing as the historical imaginary? So I don't know if others have been, having that struggle with the terminology, but I wonder if you could each sort of address the title of the panel.
Well, okay, I'll start, because I guess I'm somewhat responsible for that mess, but that was part of the idea. Initially, you might think the notion of the imagination and the writing of history, that imagination and writing history is about as desirable as creativity and basic arithmetic, right? Especially when we deal with matters of evidence, again, when you're dealing with, hot button issues, right? Like the Freud and Minna, affair or whatever. So what I was, first of all getting on is something that is well recognized by historians, which is it takes tremendous imagination, first of all, to bring up the world of the past. And you have to consider, I work in ancient studies, so the amount of imagination it requires to put yourself back in 5th century Athens is considerable. But that's precisely where there's the connection with the imaginary and questions of fantasy and subjectivity. There's a well-known formula in classics, which is the less the evidence, the more that is written on a topic. If you have a papyrus where you get 3 words that might be part of a lost tragedy of Sophocles, then the idea is you have people who then quickly write the rest of the tragedy based on the 3 words. So there's that question of reconstruction. There's the question of constructions and analysis too, that where you find that sort of affinity of the imagination. Another aspect that we've not touched upon in interest of time, perhaps we shouldn't at this point, which is how does a knowledge of the process of history or assumptions about the process of history lead you to imagine a future? And there's one question about the Freudian left, for example, that we haven't really talked about. Was there a failure of imagination in Freud's view that made it difficult for him to appreciate a place like America or to imagine some extension by means of moral authority or actual scientific policy development of psychoanalysis into a public realm, into a future? An understanding, basically, is what we know about the human past. He did have, a fairly clear developmental view, as you mentioned, when you talk about Future of an Illusion, of thinking in surprisingly, positive terms about the role of reason and science in the development of the human future. So, you could extend the notion of the historical imagination to incorporate the future in that regard. But this notion of Freud and the historical imagination also has to do with, today, why is it that Freud is such a figure that we still, in talking about, as I said, the 20th century, or the history of psychoanalysis, that he kind of returns, like Banquo's ghost constantly to this discussion. Foucault makes a distinction between what is a discourse and what is science, based on the notion that a discourse has certain foundational texts to which people return. And the irony, I suppose we can call it an historical irony, that Joel pointed out at the beginning is psychoanalysis comes from this break with tradition. And yet it constitutes its own tradition with a founding father. And this late in the game, 2007, here we are still talking about the minutiae of this founding father's behavior. So that's why the 3 of them were supposedly linked on purpose, because it's difficult to know where one, for me, conceptually, one of these areas ends and the other begins. Especially when you consider the realm of clinical insight, which is the most significant element of dynamic force, right, that in developing psychoanalysis and its cultural extensions are so closely linked. So that's my 10 cents worth.
Where is the question?
The question's over there, sorry.
Are you a clinician or an academician?
Academic.
Academic.
Scholar.
Because I was going to go back to your comment and say that I think also thinking the historical imagination and the tensions of history and the historical imagination with the tensions between, that you brought up, between science and the clinical practice. I don't think that I think they're sort of co-created. And maybe the move from an intersubjective to an intersubjective model has also not only been seen within the history of psychoanalysis, but within many other critical discourses, including the post-colonialism I spoke of, but many others, that have now allowed a mutual creation of something, as opposed to an abstract entity that something is fit into or something is evaluated alongside. So I think in the notion of the imagination, historical imagination, it reflects both on, by using a notion of imagination, human creative or some kind of internal creative process, but also of working on something beyond itself, but never you can't delineate the two. So I think that for me, the historical imagination allows us to really look back through the lens of writing history. What Richard said, you know, that this is all, history is all, has been created after, like as Derrida would say, after the text has already been written, the author is long gone. So I think we can't actually parse those things out, but maybe now in the 21st century, we think about them as much more co-creative than we think of them as extremely divided, which certainly was the case in the past. Now this may offer no new insight to your question, but I think it tempers the two of them, which I think is what one of the contributions of a panel like this is, to really reflect on that the speaking of history, each time we speak it, we think we know we are speaking of a discourse of knowledge that exists outside, that we can grasp, rather than something that is being produced and created each time we engage in a text, each time we engage in it with an object.
Well, that's one thing that all of your presentations had in common, was the tension between what you could call fact, or the real, and what is either projected, or in some ways what Freud has to come up with, say, in Totem and Taboo, or Moses and monotheism, to sort of myth-make himself in order to come up with a theory. And it just feels to me like as though the panel is speaking in different directions about historical imagination. So it was less a question than just asking for a clarification of what the topic is. And I mean, the one thing that does seem to emerge is this tension between fact or history and projection. On one hand, you were saying that there's kind of a cultural lexicon that we all carry around archivally. And that would suggest that there's something universally true in that dream vocabulary, for instance.
Well, I mean, I think that Freud was imagining that we had some, and you know, that we could go back to some, or that we carried some kind of antiquity within our psychic processes, that part of the apparatus was actually ancient, was carried forward, a relic.
Right. Freud was imagining that? Or
Well,
Freud was positing that as...
Freud was looking at what he considered empirical evidence of that in the quote-unquote ethnographic literature of the day, which presented individuals.
You can't not bring up ideology, for instance, and the idea of being imaginary, and what Freud is actually, Freud, culture, whatever, the way that we read was universal. And this has been also at the margins of everybody's comments about how America is perceived. If you see it as a primal report, you have to overlook 500 nations that were already here. And it was, populated. So I think this is a very interesting question for psychoanalysis. At least I get it all the time from my students about truth conditions. And, well, he just made up that whole myth in Moses and monotheism. Or, the Exodus never happened, so how can you talk about Moses being an Egyptian? Or he just made up Totem and Taboo. So I think that's fascinating. And I think it's in what everything that everyone has said has aspects of it, but I'm kind of missing a focus on it.
Jerry, let me try to take up the challenge of your question also. I mean, this is my first opportunity to be part of a roundtable here. But we, of course, as individual presenters, did not coordinate with each other prior to meeting today. We decided to come together under this rubric that clearly has considerable amount of elasticity and yet provides a certain frame, I suppose, for us to improvise our remarks. And we're all included, I think, in what is a kind of performance art here, a new way of having a conversation that is more contemporary. So I think it's quite understandable that we would each come with a different inflection of how we approach the topic, and yet in some unforeseen way, to quote Derrida, the glue of the aleatory makes sense. You know, that out of the spontaneous kind of making of meaning, one thing follows another, and therefore one thing is connected to the last, and so forth. We together define in performative ways what we're talking about. And your questions stimulated in me the basic dichotomy or trichotomy of Aristotle between poetry, philosophy, and history, which is itself an ancient quarrel. And if we're going to talk about the historical imagination, I think perhaps going back to Joel's observations, being trained as a philosopher, you come from that disciplinary perspective that is looking for abstract, or you looking for things that are not contingent, perhaps, in essence, in the traditional understanding of philosophy, whereas history, of course, in the classical sense, has to do with what happens concretely, the particulars of things. And poetry somehow is between philosophy and history in that it is dealing with a particular sequence of events that forms a narrative, but it's not tied to the historical condition of truth or actuality, so therefore it has some of the qualities of philosophy. So it's almost a paradox to talk about the historical imagination, except that it says, in my view, that any attempt to... I have not read Jonathan Lear's book, so I'm going to speak based on what a friend of mine said to me when I asked him to consider it for review for Imago. Basically, he said that he felt, I might as well say it's John Kerr, who's a wonderful scholar in his own right, and his book, A Most Dangerous Method on Freud, Jung, and Spielrein, most of you probably are familiar with. He just basically said he wasn't kind of comfortable with it. And what I took from his conversation was that Jonathan Lear himself is a philosopher, so his analysis of Freud's thought is kind of insulated or removed from the nitty-gritty of the historical specificity, which includes personal biography but isn't limited to that. And so I come from a perspective in which those types of questions remain deeply important to my thinking. And I would be uncomfortable, although when we start talking about science, it becomes a little bit different and tricky, because I do think somehow, coming back to earlier remarks, that like it or not, and I'm very influenced by E.O. Wilson's work, personally, that the impact of the Enlightenment really, the fundamental difference is between societies that have undergone the scientific revolution and those that haven't. And it's not to, and in Freud's own relation to the Enlightenment project, of course, is deeply ambivalent and not simply unequivocally positive. And we all have to be mindful of the tragic costs that the quest for knowledge can bring in its wake.
Even if you have all these facts, you still have to theorize from it.
I absolutely agree.
Like the primitive accumulation of wealth.
Absolutely.
I mean, it still had to be figured out.
I agree.
What happened from it.
I completely agree.
The facts, you know,
I completely agree with you.
It's just not look at these facts. That's the fact.
I agree with you, and I agree with you. And what I love so much about psychoanalysis is that it gives us a kind of meta-language, a way of thinking with a higher degree of consciousness about the things that happen to us all the time. So I agree with you. Ultimately, we need some kind of theoretical distance to understand the things that we're talking about.
Freud must have done that too.
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't be spending all my time studying Freud if I didn't think he'd made immeasurable contributions. But I just wanted to say one more thing about America, if I might. And George has written about this, and John Kerr has written about it too in his wonderful book. You know, Freud at one time, when he was still courting Martha Bernays, himself thought of moving to America and starting up over here where he could really do much better than he could back in the old country. And so Jung and Freud both shared a certain fantasy of America as the place where their wishes could come true. So for Freud to come to America was really very much on the model of the Acropolis, to refer to Richard's outstanding book. You know, that this was so good it couldn't possibly be real. And, you know, he had the fainting episode in Bremen just before they left, and with all the peat bog corpses, and Freud quotes the joke that the roofer said, "How's it going? So far so good," said the roofer as he began to fall. So in my view, it's at least possible to suggest that some of the reason that Freud was so ambivalent toward America was because of the experience of analyzing his dreams, and Jung's attempt to take him, you know, to ask him to open up about the experience with his sister-in-law that Jung had been informed of, and Freud's refusal to do that. And that we know from, Deirdre Barrett quotes this in her biography of Jung, and there is an interview that Jung gave to Kurt Eisler that goes into this, that is now de-restricted in the Library of Congress, that Freud had a urinary incontinence while he was in the United States that was an erotic symptom. And we know how Freud theorized about urethral erotism and all the rest of it, and linked it to ambition. And so that I think that one strong contributing factor to Freud's attitude toward America could have been connected with the fact that this was the place where he wanted to, he was going to be awarded an honorary degree, so he had the experience of being wrecked by success and the return of all of his survivor guilt, and connected with the confrontation that remained on some deep level unspoken with Jung, with Ferenczi as the infantile bystander who picked up on the telepathy that was going on, you know, and so that the larger cultural issues, which have their own autonomy, and I don't mean to reduce everything to the personal, but if we're going to study history, we have to know specifically what we're talking about. Okay, that we can open up general questions and all make, you know, interventions that are interesting and thoughtful, but ultimately historians have to know the details of their subject, as any scholar does in his or her field. Okay, so whether it's Freud or it's Wagner or whatever, you know, subject we want to investigate, ultimately to be historians we need to have some mastery of the details of the subject, and I suppose that's true if you're going to be a clinical analyst. You know, some analysts believe that they can interpret everything in terms of countertransference and fantasy, but I'm on the side of those who think it's actually important to know something about the facts of the patient's life.
But I wouldn't interpret Freud's incontinence just because you think it was what it was.
How would you interpret it?
I would wait for Freud to tell me that.
Well,
sorry?
Respond to this?
Okay. If you can wait just 1 minute more, Joe wants to respond, and then we'll take your question. And thank you very much for being patient.
I really don't want to hog the floor, but there's a certain sort of urgency, and it's not urinary in this. I mean, it's probably obvious from the things I've said that my position goes a bit against the contemporary grain. And I think for many years now, not just in philosophy or in psychoanalysis, but in culture in general, we've been living through, we call it the linguistic turn, call it the hermeneutical turn, however you want to put it, which at one point was very, very important because it undermined the dominance of a certain sort of rigid positivism that dominated the American university and the American intellectual scene. But I think we, like I said earlier, have spent so much time stressing the moment of construction, of interpretation, of projection, of the episteme, of the frame, all these things, that now it's really time to move on to a question that begs to be addressed. Namely, how do why aren't all of these different interpretive frameworks, or epistemes, or paradigms, as McDowell puts it, how are they not just frictionlessly spinning in their own conceptual web? How do they rub up against reality? And we have to come back to the question of the object. The problem is we can't come back to it and just be objectivists, because that position's already been demolished. And the hard question is how to come back to the question of the object and objectivity after we've been through this linguistic turn. And I just have to point this out. I mean, Peter, on the one hand you said we all have our own personal preferences, and that's what makes us choose our theoretical frameworks, and the theoretical frameworks are incommensurate in this and that. On the other hand, you said, as historians, as analysts, we have to know the facts about our patient's life. And those two are just completely incompatible with each other. You cannot explain how we can know about the facts of a patient's life if you take this hermeneutical radical position.
I think you misunderstood my position, because I'm much closer to your view than I think than you've taken it from me. Because my own work is very much. I had the privilege of being a graduate student at Yale in the late 70s, which was the most intense period of postmodernism, and I tried to learn as much as I could from it, but I never followed that path. So I too am interested in finding my way back outside the prison house of language, or without minimizing the contribution that way of thinking has offered. Okay, what I was saying about my observation about the fact that within the clinical setting, people may use different subjective frameworks that may be successful therapeutically in terms of their interactions with their patients. I was precisely saying that ultimately is a problem, because that is not adequate to sorting out the underlying question of how shall we choose what theoretical framework to adopt. And in order to answer that underlying question, we need to adhere to a method that attempts to counter the tendency to invoke subjectivity by employing what is traditionally understood to be a scientific method, which cannot be done in an intersubjective situation. And so just as it would be untenable to, if one accepts fundamentally the theory of evolution, for example, okay, then creationism is a discredited theory, etc. Okay, but so if we extrapolate from that to questions of what do we really know, psychoanalysis, of course, has had as its bread and butter theories of infancy, but there's the tension between the understanding of infancy and childhood as reconstructed in the clinical setting and what infant research can tell us, you see. And so my basic claim is that psychoanalysis and neuroscience, of course, has been in the, kind of built on attachment theory to ask psychoanalysts and those of us who care about psychoanalysis to heed the call of thinking about what science can teach us in order to sort out which of our theoretical claims have stood the test of time and which have not, which then we can bring back into the clinical setting, where again the subjective is the heart and soul of it, and we would not want to exclude that. You see, so I'm in agreement, I think, in large part with your critique of the postmodernist turn. But I don't see a tension between the various aspects of a complex position that I was trying to articulate.
Thank you. Now, finally, a question.
Just with all due respect, my name is Jerry Fuchs, and with all due respect to the conversation, it appears that the conversation was not clarified before the speakers came, that is, that no one was familiar with each other's paper. And so what has resulted, to my way of thinking, has been this unique roundtable discussion, which is unique in its spontaneity. But I have to say that it somewhat loses me in the course of the afternoon. It's been so abstract and in many ways so abstruse. And what troubles me the most is that there seems to be this need in the New York Times to keep on picking away at the historical aspects of Freud. 100 years ago, and we're still playing with the ashes. Joel says, I think appropriately, so we're just spinning more webs. And where does the reality or the wheel come to the road? And there are 50 years of other thinkers and writers and psychoanalysts who have been working in this area. But today's discussion brings in historical amber ashes moving around, it seems to me, and I'm not quite sure where we've come to. I'm not sure where history really substantiates various claims. It's just a statement on my part. I've found this too abstruse for my thinking, and I'm reasonably well read in this area.
Anyone care to respond? Well, one thing that I might say is simply, again, not coming from a clinical perspective at all, which is simply that the growth of Freud's studies generally has been very important in integrating certain fields within the humanities, precisely on themes that quite often are technically divorced. That is, for example, the history of science and Jewish history and gender studies, etc. And I think one of the interesting problems that we face right now is precisely that we're in the midst of a very large interdisciplinary growth that is creating the kind of babble that maybe is part of the problem today. But I think that it would be a serious mistake then to think that we shouldn't continue to suffer the babble to a degree, because this is precisely, I think, the great moment of integration. And so I'm sorry if you feel a bit lost in this, but I think that that's symptomatic of the moment that we're trying to seize. And one, again, coming from perhaps the farthest distance, that is from classical studies into this discussion, that I think is the one thing I would like you to carry away today and keep in mind, that sometimes the most important moments in terms of their intellectual ferment can be muddled moments. And again, I go back to this when I think about Freud writing Totem and Taboo, and knowing, for example, the very strange and eclectic mix of things that go into that book. The sheer audacity of it astounds me, and how his would-be colleagues, in a sense, the Cambridge ritualists, are not really on the same page, even they're using similar data. I don't know if you know this anecdote, that he sent a copy to James Fraser, who wrote the Golden Bough and was very influential, very large part of his reading, in fact, for Totem and Taboo came from that, and never received a response. So to me, it's precisely the difficult aspect of articulating what it is and how it is we're going to approach the question that you're witnessing.
I think that's what we were going to call it.
I just wanted to introduce a different metaphor, maybe in keeping with Freudian history. I kept in my mind saying this, when coming this last part, coming to this, I kept thinking this is a ravishing of the implicit. And what I mean by that, and the ravishing is, the sexual, and maybe some of the disturbance or impatience is the American Puritanism, that we don't like things to be at loose ends, or there's a pun for you too as well. And so my comment is, one of the things I've liked about coming to these meetings is that this frequently happens, and we don't get, I love it, and we don't get as close, well, the ones I've been to, we haven't gotten as close to self-reference about what's happening in the present as we did just now. But I really like that, and I think there's no reason why, I'm not historical, I'm not 100 years ago, that on some level we shouldn't be coming close to the reality of our own experience, which we tend, again, using some of the things that were said here, to censor, or your, I think, concern about these aspects of the subjective, that we, put up barriers to things that make us uncomfortable. So I think the discomfort that has been expressed today, I would want to applaud. In contrast to some people who might want to say we should keep it nice.